Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Through Our Lens, our Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Jeanette Ducat, and I'll be the facilitator on behalf of the Risk and Safety Training Center of Excellence. So on behalf of the team, we would like to thank you for joining our webinar today. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded so that you can have it for future reference. And just because of the sheer number of people attending today, we've decided to mute everybody until the very end, just so that you can have a seamless experience that's controlled and without distractions. That being said, we're gonna get started. Today's honored guest is brought to you by UC Office of the President. And so Environmental Health and Safety hopes that this session will inspire you and strengthen you in your career in health and safety. But before we get started, I wanted to take a minute to go over some administrative items. If you haven't already been muted, please go ahead and mute yourself. There are over 100 people attending today. And the presentation itself will be about 30 to 35 minutes. After that, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions at the very end. If at any time during the presentation you want to ask a question, please do so using the chat function in Zoom. And we will go over how to use the chat function in just a moment. And as always, after the event, we would love to get your feedback, so you will be sent a link to evaluate today's webinar. Again, since you'll be muted, you still have the opportunity to ask a question by using the chat function. And in order to get to the chat function, you'd have to move your mouse to the very bottom of your screen. And so when you click on chat, what'll happen is that a window will open up to the right, and you can see where it says type message here. That's where you can go ahead and enter your question. When you hit the enter key, it'll appear at the top of the group chat. And so if your question is chosen, it will be asked on your behalf at the very end, or we may unmute you so you can ask the question yourselves. So that being said, today to introduce our honored speaker, we have Ken Smith from UC Office of the President. And if you would give me a moment, I'm going to see if I can find him. Oh, here you go. So Ken, would you like to introduce Larry Wong?
Yes, welcome everybody. It's indeed my my privilege and honor here to introduce my colleague and friend, Larry Wong. For many of you, Larry needs no introduction, but for those that don't know, Larry has worked in the environmental health and safety profession for over 45 years. He's currently the Associate EH&S Director for the University of California Office of the President. And in that role, Larry is responsible for providing system-wide direction, consultation, and assistance to all of our campuses and our medical centers. Larry has served as EH&S Director for both UC Santa Cruz, UC Merced, UC Riverside, and San Francisco State University during his tenure here at the Office of the President. Before coming to the University of California, Larry also served as the section chief for California DTSC, where he managed the environmental regulatory programs. And prior to that position, Larry served as an industrial hygienist with Cal OSHA, where he performed field inspections, conducted occupational safety and health research, and developed several proposed regulations that actually became, in fact, actual regulations by the Cal OSHA Standards Board. Larry is also a very distinguished certified industrial hygienist, and he was elected a fellow of the American Industrial Hygiene Association in 2009. He's both past chair of the AIHA Laboratory Health and Safety Committee and the AIHA Environmental Issues Committee. Larry is also a graduate of Cal, go Bears, and has been an instructor for UC Davis Extension EH&S safety programs for over 25 years, as well as a current instructor for UC's Berkeley Labor Occupational Health Program since 2014. Larry has been involved in many publications and consensus standards in the area of employee health and safety training, nanotechnology research, and most notably the use of alternative tracer gases for laboratory fume hood testing. And so with that, let me turn over the presentation to Larry here.
Thanks so much, Ken. And without further ado, everybody, I would like to bring to you Larry Wong. Just a moment.
Welcome to a retrospective view of 45 years in EH&S. I am Larry Wong, the UCOP Associate EH&S Director. For this webinar, I would like to not only share my 45-year journey in the EH&S field, but also share some major changes and milestones in the EH&S arena which I have observed over the years. A quick overview of my EH&S journey. I began my career in 1974 as a radiation technician with the Radiological Health Branch at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo. This is where they overhaul nuclear submarines. I worked in the environmental monitoring and dosimetry areas of the program. After 1 year, I was promoted to a health physicist. In 1977, I was offered an industrial hygienist position with Cal OSHA. As an industrial hygienist, I performed compliance inspections for the first 8 years, and the last 2 years, I worked in the Special Studies Unit, where we performed field research on specific occupational health issues. Before I left Cal OSHA, I worked in the Research and Standards Unit, where I developed proposed regulations to present to the Cal OSHA Standards Board. In 1987, I moved to the Department of Toxic Substances Control, commonly known as DTSC. I started there as a regional industrial hygienist, and after 1 year, I was promoted to become a section chief, where I managed various environmental health programs. In 1989, I became an adjunct EH&S instructor at UC Davis Extension, where I taught EH&S classes until 2004. These courses were part of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, commonly known as NEIHS. It was a grant program to provide health and safety training to workers. In 2001, I was offered a program manager position at UC San Francisco. I spent 5 years at UCSF as a program manager overseeing the campus safety program. In 2006, I was offered the UCOP EH&S program manager position, where initially the primary focus was to develop and implement the safety program for the Office of the President. Other responsibilities was to provide support for UC system-wide projects and work groups. From 2012 to 2018, I was offered the opportunity to serve various stints as the interim EH&S director at 3 UC campuses and at San Francisco State University. I also provided EH&S technical support and advice to all the UC campuses and medical centers, including performing mock inspections and training to prepare the campuses for Cal OSHA inspections as part of the UC Lab Safety Settlement Agreement. In 2014, UC Davis began phasing themselves out of the NEIH grant program, so I began teaching health and safety classes at the UC Berkeley Labor Occupational Health Program, commonly known as LOHP. A little history regarding the State Occupational Health Program. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the William Steiger Occupational Health Act of 1970, which established the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, commonly known as OSHA. OSHA has regulatory jurisdiction over the private sector, but does not have jurisdiction over the government sector. The Occupational Safety and Health Act allows states to establish state occupational safety and health program as long as the state program is at least as effective as the federal OSHA program. Health and safety in California. On June 24, 1971, the Selmar tunnel explosion occurred in a water tunnel Lockheed Shipbuilding and Construction was constructing for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Several months before, there was an earthquake near Selmar which ruptured gas lines. On June 23rd, the miners hit the gas pocket, which resulted in a non-fatal flash fire. On June 24th, it was decided to resume the mining operations with additional ventilation and testing requirements for the gas. The plan was that operations would cease if gas levels exceeded 40% of the lower explosive limit. It was reported that several instances were recorded in which the gas levels exceeded the 40% LEL levels, but the job was not shut down. After the late shift change, a fatal explosion occurred, causing the death of 17 men. This incident was the worst mining and tunneling incident in California history and resulted in an increased awareness of health and safety issues in California. With the recent Salmar incident, there was strong legislative support for the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1973. The Department of Industrial Relations, Division of Industrial Safety, administered the program. An interagency agreement was established with the Department of Health, the Occupational Health Branch, to provide industrial hygiene support for the Cal OSHA program, and the Department of Health Industrial Hygiene Lab provided analytical services for Cal OSHA. In 1976, California passed the Occupational Carcinogen Control Act, which required the use of carcinogens to be reported to Cal OSHA. The act increased the classification of carcinogen violations from general to serious violations. As a result of this new statute, the Occupational Health Branch created the Occupational Carcinogen Control Unit to increase awareness of the new regulatory requirements and increase inspections for the users of carcinogens. In April of 1977, I was hired as an industrial hygienist in the Occupational Carcinogens Control Unit. I did public outreach, provided consultation to employers, including the city and county of San Francisco, and also conducted compliance inspections. Major findings during my inspections were that 5209 carcinogens, due to the complex regulatory requirement, every employer wanted to dispose of their 5209 carcinogens. From over 100 employees who were inspected, only IBM in San Jose was found to be the only employer to be in full compliance with 5209. Numerous asbestos uses were found. Most unusual was that all the wineries used a specifically made asbestos filter to filter their wine. The highest asbestos short-term exposure concentrations I found was 170 fibers per cc for brake arcing operations and 120 fibers per cc for emptying bags of asbestos into a mixing vat. In 1977, the permissible exposure limit for asbestos was 2 fibers per cc and a short-term exposure limit of 10 fibers per cc. What does a Cliff Bar have to do with California occupational safety and health? Well, the Cliff Bar was developed in 1991 by Gary Erickson. He named the bar after his father, Clifford Erickson, who was his companion on several trips when they would venture into the Sierra Nevada mountains. It so happened that Cliff Erickson was a long-term safety engineer with Cal OSHA. So, the Cliff Bar was named after a fellow health and safety professional. One major incident which had national and international repercussions was an ongoing exposure incident to workers at the Occidental chemical plant on the DBCP line. The workers noted that no one in their line were able to have children. When they were tested, it was found that all the workers were found to be sterile. What was ironic is that in the 1960s, a researcher at UCSF, Charlie Hine, published an article which found DBCP had an adverse effect on the testes of animals. This incident led to numerous public hearings and resulted in an emergency DBCP regulation, along with the creation of the 1981 Department of Industrial Relations Director's List of Hazardous Substances. It also led to the first workers' right to know regulations in the U.S., the Hazard Communication Standard in 1982. It was the Cal OSHA Hazard Communication Standards, on which the first OSHA HAZCOM standard was based on. In 1978, the Occupational Health Branch was merged with the Division of Industrial Safety to form a combined agency within the Department of Industrial Relations. This agency was named the Division of Occupational Safety and Health, or DOSH. You may notice, if you look at the Title 8 regulations in the table of contents for Chapter 4, it still refers to the Division of Industrial Safety. Other incidents which occurred at UCSF that are worth noting. In 1979, there was a Q fever outbreak for employees working with pregnant sheep. It resulted in 19 cases, which included 1 fatality. A Cal-OSHA inspection took place and resulted in a special order being issued to UCSF, which addressed training, exposure controls, medical surveillance, and use of PPE, including N95 respiratory protection. A few years ago, with increased controls, training, and work practices, Cal-OSHA withdrew the special order which was issued to UCSF. In 1981, there were complaints regarding the handling of anti-neoplastic agents at UCSF and several hospitals in the San Francisco Bay Area. Concerns were improper mixing, lack of procedures, agents being mixed on the patient floors with no controls, a lack of training, and lack of personal protective equipment. This resulted in a special order being issued to UCSF and several hospitals requiring them to mix anti-neoplastic agent in a specific type of biological safety cabinet. The special order also required the hospital to develop procedures and emergency spill plans and also provide training and proper personal protective equipment. In January 1987, Governor George Deukmejian announced in his budget proposal to turn back the Cal-OSHA program to the federal government. This would result in a savings of $8 million per year because the Cal-OSHA state program operated on a 50-50 split, in which 50% of the funding would come from the federal government and the remaining 50% would come from the state budget. This would not completely kill the Cal-OSHA program because Cal-OSHA would still run a program to cover the public sector government employees. The major impact on worker health and safety is that federal OSHA regulations were not as stringent as California's, especially the PELs, which were based on the 1968 ACGIH TLVs and are never updated. Cal-OSHA updated their PELs every 3 or 4 years. Also, OSHA staffing and coverage never approached the numbers of health and safety staff which Cal-OSHA had established for the state of California. After the budget proposal announcement, approximately 25 to 30% of the Cal-OSHA staff left the program for jobs in private sector or in other state agencies. It was later determined that the number of compliance inspections conducted by OSHA during the first year after the disengagement was only 25% of what Cal-OSHA normally conducts in a year, and the number of citations issued by OSHA was only 14% of the number in which Cal-OSHA issues annually. In 1988, an initiative led by labor placed Proposition 97 on the ballot to mandate the reinstatement of the Cal-OSHA program to levels pre-1987. The proposition passed in November 1988 with 53% of the votes, and the program was reinstated in July of 1989. The program was reinstated. However, the Cal-OSHA program was decimated due to the loss of several experienced health and safety staff. With the disengagement of Cal-OSHA in 1987, I was reassigned to the Cal-OSHA headquarters in the Research and Standards Unit. My assignment was to expand Section 5208, the asbestos regulation, from a 4-page general industry regulation to an asbestos construction regulation, a general industry regulation, and a non-asbestiform regulation. A lot of the rulemaking was to incorporate the recently promulgated federal OSHA asbestos regulations, but we also wanted to keep California-specific requirements in the regulations. The PEL for the asbestos regulation would drop from 2 fibers per cc to 0.2 fibers per cc. It was over 1,000 pages of rulemaking, which I completed by November of 1987. Knowing that I did not want to do rulemaking for my foreseeable career, in November of 1987, I moved to Cal EPA, the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Towards the end of the 1980s, there were concerns regarding California's economic competitiveness, especially due to the skyrocketing cost of workers' compensation insurance. SB 198 was the proposed solution. This mandated employers to develop and implement an effective injury, illness, and prevention program. The rationale behind this requirement was that if an effective IIPP were to be developed and implemented, loss rates would decrease and the workers' comp insurance rates would go down. In the 1970s and the 1980s, there were several instances of employers knowingly allowing unsafe conditions to exist which could have resulted in serious injuries or death. Some employers would also fail to notify employees or conceal serious health and safety hazards. The passage of the California Corporate Criminal Liability Act was passed as a deterrent for employers who may elect to expose their workers to serious health and safety conditions. Up until the end of the 20th century, Cal-OSHA penalties were considered to be very low or moderate when compared with other regulatory agencies. This resulted in some companies not correcting violations and just considered penalties to be more or less the cost of doing business. In 1999, with the support of labor and the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the state legislature passed AB 1127, which increased Cal-OSHA penalties in several ways. Major changes were: 1, the maximum penalty for serious violations increased from $7,000 to $25,000. 2, government agencies were no longer exempt from paying civil penalties for Cal-OSHA violations. However, there was an exemption added for K-12 schools, community colleges, CSU, and UCs. If the individual school location receives no serious Cal-OSHA citations for 2 years, the school would be able to petition for a refund of the civil penalty. 3, persons or corporations who have been found to have falsified a signed statement of abatement of a violation can be assessed a criminal penalty of up to $30,000 for an individual or up to $300,000 for a corporation. Let's talk about federal OSHA and the permissible exposure limits. The basis for the majority of the OSHA PELs at the time of the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 was the existing federal standards, which were the Walsh-Healy Act in 1970, which referred to the 1968 ACGIH TLV listing. This became the basis for the OSHA PEL table in Title 29 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 1910-1000. In 1989, OSHA attempted to update its PELs and adopt new PELs for 164 new chemicals and revise the PELs for 212 chemicals. However, labor, the AFL-CIO, filed a suit against OSHA asking the courts to overturn the PEL revisions because certain chemicals were not included in the 1989 PEL revision. In July of 1992, the federal courts overturned the OSHA PEL revision. To date, states which operate under federal OSHA jurisdiction still use the PELs which were adopted in 1970. However, for substances which were new, OSHA uses the general duty clause for exposure limits for the new chemicals. In November of 1987, I took a position with DTSC. Initially, I was a regional industrial hygienist for the Northern California Coast DTSC office. I will always remember my first field inspection with DTSC. It was a complaint which alleged two brothers were burying drums of hazardous waste on their property. It was also alleged that the brothers were known to have firearms and were willing to use them. So, at 5 in the morning on the date of the inspection, at a nearby Safeway parking lot, DTSC staff met with county staff and the county SWAT team to serve the warrant to inspect the property. The warrant was served and the property was inspected, but no buried drums were found. In 1988, I became a section chief in the DTSC Surveillance and Enforcement Unit, where we conducted inspections primarily of permitted hazardous waste facilities, but also responded to hazardous waste complaints. The California Hazardous Waste Regulations were a result of the Resource and Recovery Act, RCRA, of 1980. In California, pre-RCRA, the hazardous waste regulations were only 6 pages. In 1992, the Hazardous Waste Treatment Permit Reform Act was passed, which simplified the authorization process for treatment and storage of non-RCRA hazardous waste. The lower tiers of the authorization were permit by rule, commonly known as PBR, conditional authorization, also known as CA, and conditionally exempt, also known as CE. One of the requirements which many facilities were unaware of was that PBR and CE authorizations required the facilities to conduct an initial Phase 1 environmental assessment. Another area which grew in the 1980s and 90s is household hazardous waste. Many cities and counties developed household hazardous waste collection programs to help minimize these waste streams from ending up in the landfill. From 1995 to 2001, I was a DTSC manager of the State Household Hazardous Waste Collection Program. It was noted that training requirements for household hazardous waste collection workers were sometimes not straightforward in states which did not have a state OSHA program. So at the request of the North American Hazardous Materials Management Association, commonly known as NAMA, I was given the opportunity to develop and carry through an ASTM standard. It was ASTM standard D6498, the standard guide for household hazardous waste training outline for household hazardous waste collection operations. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, businesses expressed concerns to their representatives that they were being inspected for hazardous materials by various city, county, and state agencies. They were being asked the same type of questions, and businesses were paying multiple fees and getting multiple permits. In response to regulatory concerns by business, in 1993, the state legislature passed SB 1082, which created the Certified Unified Program Agency, or commonly known as the CUPA program, to regulate and manage 6 hazardous materials program in California. Businesses would receive 1 permit from the CUPA and would only pay a single fee. The CUPA program would be managed by Cal EPA with additional oversight from DTSC, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, Office of Emergency Services, and the State Water Resources Control Board. The 6 programs which the CUPA is regulated are the Business Plan, the Cal ARP program, the UST program, the Above Ground Petroleum Storage Act, the Hazardous Waste Generator and Tiered Permitting Programs, and the Uniform Fire Code and the Hazardous Materials Management and Inventory Programs. CUPAs were either county, city, or local agencies who applied to Cal EPA to become authorized to run all 6 programs. Within some CUPA jurisdictions, there was a possibility for another agency to run one or more of the programs as a participating agency. Cal EPA initially delegated the CUPA application process to DTSC, where we would work with local agencies in the application process, hold public hearings, and DTSC would make a recommendation to Cal EPA to approve or reject the local agency's CUPA application. The majority of the CUPAs were county programs, but there were several counties in which a city or several cities elected to become a CUPA. CUPAs are evaluated every 3 years by Cal EPA and the 5 affected state agencies. The California CUPA program has become the most comprehensive local government-driven hazardous materials, hazardous waste, and emergency response program in the nation. In 2001, I moved from Cal EPA to UCSF. In the early 2000s, EPA found several colleges and universities were not properly managing hazardous waste. This was especially true in EPA Region 1, the New England states, and also at the University of Hawaii, which received a $1.7 million penalty for the improper management of hazardous waste. In the spirit of cooperation in 2001 and 2002, UC EH&S leadership elected to conduct a self-audit of all 10 campuses and submit a self-disclosure to EPA, DTSC, and the local CUPAs. At UCSF, there was a very unique research laboratory incident which led to UC partnering with Ansel Glove to fill a PPE gap in regards to chemical hand protection. At a research laboratory in the School of Dentistry, a researcher was doing a DNA extraction using phenylchloroform. The researcher performing the procedure did it in a biological safety cabinet, not in a fume hood. He was wearing a lab coat and thin latex gloves. While transferring the phenylchloroform from the container into the test tube, a small amount of phenylchloroform dripped onto the edge of the test tube and ended up on the outside of the test tube. The liquid on the outside of the test tube made it slippery, and when the researcher held the test tube, it slipped out of his hand, causing the entire test tube of phenylchloroform to splash onto his glove hands. The phenylchloroform flowed down the glove onto his arm and eventually ended up in his crotch. He ended up going to the emergency shower to wash off the phenylchloroform and was sent to the hospital. Because the phenylchloroform got into his crotch, the doctor elected to hold the researcher overnight for observation. This normally would not be a Cal OSHA reportable serious injury. However, the UCSF campus workers' comp manager elected to report this incident to the local Cal OSHA district office. Cal OSHA conducted an inspection of the incident and noticed that the phenylchloroform manufacturer, MSDS, specifically stated, "Do not use thin latex gloves for protection." Cal OSHA cited UCSF for several violations, including a serious violation for not using proper hand protection. They assessed a civil penalty of over $30,000. We went into an informal conference where we managed to get the civil penalty reduced by roughly 50%. Prior to the informal conference, we did involve UPT, the union rep, to ensure that they were well informed about the issues regarding the violations. So when we met with Cal OSHA, the union rep did not agree with what the Cal OSHA inspector wanted. In the end, we found that there were no gloves on the market with good dexterity which were conducive to laboratory work. So we approached the local ANSO glove representative, and ANSO agreed to work with UCSF to develop a thinner glove which provides protection against phenylchloroform. This resulted in the development of the ANSO Chemtech Viton Butyl glove. This goes to show that if you work with your vendors and present an issue to them, they will try to work with you to find a solution. In this particular situation, the University of California was ANSO's largest customer in the world, so they were willing to work with us to find a solution. In 2006, the California State Legislature passed the California Global Warming Solutions Act, which required California to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. The California Standards Board also passed a fume hood regulation in 2006, which required laboratory fume hoods which operate in the setback mode to be tested using an abbreviated ASHRAE 110 method, which is the method for measuring performance of laboratory fume hoods. Unfortunately, the ASHRAE 110 method requires the use of sulfur hexafluoride, commonly known as SF6, which is one of the worst greenhouse gases in the market. It has a global warming potential over 23,000 times greater than carbon dioxide. So in partnership with Technical Safety Services, or TSS, UC petitioned the Standards Board for variants which allowed UC to use nitrous oxide as a substitute gas for its ASHRAE 110 test. Based on past construction trends within the UC system, it was estimated that ASHRAE 110 variants has reduced UC's greenhouse gas emissions by approximately 1 million pounds per year. On another note, UC is required to conduct research using various gases. The Air Resources Board was initially proposing to do an outright ban on the use of SF6 for all uses. During the rulemaking process, we were able to convince the Air Resources Board to allow for an SF6 exemption for research purposes. The unfortunate 2009 laboratory fatality at UCLA had a massive impact on academic research laboratories, not only in the U.S., but also internationally. It pushed some researchers to improve laboratory safety culture to prevent similar accidents. However, some of the changes pushed laboratory safety to a follow these rules and regulations mentality rather than improve the safety culture by having open communications regarding safety concerns and also improving safety training and education, which would include risk assessment and strong support from university management. In 2012, UC entered into a settlement agreement with the Los Angeles County District Attorney. The major requirements of the settlement agreement were a listing of all the labs, lab safety training for PIs and all lab personnel, development of SOPs, having a lab safety manual in the lab, developing safe use procedures for pyrophoric, conducting PPE hazard assessment, requiring the use of proper PPE, an enhanced reporting of serious injuries, and Cal OSHA would conduct up to 3 campus inspections per year during the length of the settlement agreement. As a whole, UC did a very good job in meeting the requirements of the settlement agreement. To help campuses prepare for the upcoming Cal OSHA inspection, for the 8 campuses who requested support, I conducted mock Cal OSHA inspections to prepare the chemistry and biochemistry labs, in which I provided the laboratories with tips on what the Cal OSHA inspectors would look for and recommendations on what steps they could take to improve their chances on surviving the inspection. At the end of the settlement agreement timeline, the UC campuses did fare pretty well with the inspections. The only serious violations found were the types of gloves which were being used with pyrophoric chemicals and unguarded belts on vacuum pumps. In closing, to be successful in the EH&S field, it is important to develop good personal qualities, integrity, honesty, and virtue. These qualities will help you succeed with your customers, your coworkers, direct reports, and management. If you lack these personal qualities, you will not succeed. Be honest, be trustworthy, offer to help when needed, fulfill your promises, treat others with respect, and give credit where credit is due, and be willing to admit when you're wrong. Since EH&S supports programs to implement their health and safety program, EH&S is a technical expert we should offer to assist supervisors, managers, directors, and PIs to address health and safety issues insofar as practicable. You also need to develop personal relationships with your customers. When such relationships are established, you will be able to have trust and credibility with your customers, and they would more likely contact you for assistance. To be successful not only in the EH&S field, but also in your everyday life, I suggest you look at persons who you admire. It could be a family member, a coworker, a supervisor, or a friend. Write down what are the qualities in that person that you admire. These are the qualities which you should try to develop and emulate to become a better colleague, better supervisor, or just a better person. Likewise, for that person who everyone in the office avoids, what are the negative qualities in that person? Do you have any of those qualities exist in you? If you do, you need to make a concerted effort to improve yourself and rid yourself of those negative qualities, or everyone in the office may end up running away once you enter their office. In closing, I prefer not to look at career accomplishments, but rather look at 45 years and see the impact I've had on colleagues and friends. Activities which I was involved in, which gives me great pleasure, is being a part of the NEIHS training program to provide safety training and information to thousands of workers through fun and interactive training methods. Visiting and interacting with EH&S staff on the campuses to mentor, advise, and develop friendships. And lastly, developing student assistants who eventually became UC employees, such as Karen C. and Bernadette Santos. That's my closing words of wisdom. Thank you.
I apologize, I was speaking this whole time. Anyway, I want to say thank you again to Larry for providing us that overview of the milestones of regulations throughout the years, how they've impacted our work, and yeah, and how we can do better or learn from your experience on strengthening our own careers by just being kind to people and finding out ways of being effective. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to questions. And so before Larry gets back onto the screen, I wanted to just kind of share with you how you can ask questions. You can either ask questions by using the chat function on the bottom, or there's also a way, which we'll go over in a second, for you to raise your hand. So again, we will try to prioritize the questions that have come in through the chat, but you can also raise your hand. So the way you raise your hand is you mouse over to the very bottom of your screen, and you can click on this participants icon. When you click on participants icon, you'll see the list of everybody who is attending, and in the very bottom right-hand corner, there's a button you can click on to raise your hand. And so if anybody has a question at this point, please go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions that we've received from the chat. So now that Larry's back online, I'm going to go ahead and welcome him. So as soon as I unmute him, Larry, welcome back. I guess one of the questions we have for you that came in is, who in the UC has influenced you the most and why?
One person, that's hard to choose. I would say on how I manage people, my first contact with UCSF was working under Eugene Lau. This is management style, and he kind of made work kind of fun to be with and all that. So Eugene, he had a big influence on me then. And also, it's kind of funny, when I first went to work at UCSF, they were always mixing us up. They mixed me up with Eugene and mix Eugene up for me. So I'd be in a meeting and they'd say, "Hey, Eugene." I said, "No, I'm not Eugene, I'm Larry." Yes. Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Larry. We have another question that came in from Doug Harvey. Any words of wisdom that you have going forward other than you've already shared? So that's from Doug.
Well, other than words of wisdom, again, it's just working with the people that you deal with, and sometimes, especially the real bad, when you run into real bad issues, still try to be constructive when you work with them. They might have made small steps when they're trying to correct it, but it's still a step. So what you have to do is, even though there's a lot more to do, is still praise your customers in terms of making the effort, and you just take it bit by bit by bit. That's really important in all that, because you start to be overly critical, they're just going to shut you out, and you're going to have someone who's not going to be cooperative.
Thank you for that. Larry, we also have Debbie Decker on the line, and so we wanted to give Debbie from UC Davis a chance to ask her question. Debbie, are you ready?
Sure. Thanks very much, Jeanette. Thank you, Larry, for offering that perspective of your long career. I particularly appreciated you talking there at the very end about your professional values, but it surprised me, and so I didn't have a notepad out, and so I couldn't snag them quickly. So this may be a question for Jeanette. Will Larry's slides be provided later, or can Larry just reiterate those professional values?
Sure. So before I give it back to Larry, yes, absolutely. The slides should be available for download, if not now, in the next few minutes from the website, training.ucr.edu/speakers. We will also email everybody a reminder of where to find the slides, so you definitely can get back to it. But Larry, would you just want to kind of give just a 1 to 2 minute review of those values at the end where you talked about how to be successful? Thank you for the question.
Yeah. Well, again, it's just being proactive and working with your customers. Proactive and working with the customers, and more or less be yourself. You talk to people, be truthful, and don't lead them on in terms of things and all that. Other than that, it's best you look at the presentation for what I said on things. Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Larry. We have another question from Scott Bourdon from the California State University. Welcome, Scott. I guess the question was, of all the information you had up on the slides, how did you keep track of it? Did you keep track of it as you went? Or was it on your resume? Or did you have to look it up, some of those milestones?
A lot of it was just kind of from memory, going back to old files and looking up stuff. There's a lot of things. Yeah. If you've looked at my files, I have things going back over 30 years and all that in terms of some things and all that. So it just, as a typical IH from the 30 years ago, I keep a lot of records and files and all that. Which now, unfortunately, I got to clean all that stuff out of my office now. Okay.
Well, it's good advice for us. As we go along and as we see history pass right before our eyes, it's good to kind of document it sometime. Even as though many of us have experienced the fatality in 2009 when we were there. It just seems like yesterday, yet it was 10 years ago, and you documented it, and that's why we're able to learn from it. So as we go on, it would be good advice for us to do what you did and just kind of hang on to things, maybe take pictures of everything.
Yes.
Debbie has another question, and it's, what's the funnest project or assignment that you have worked on, Larry? What's the funnest project or assignment?
The funnest one? Oh, let me think about that. I kind of enjoyed working on that fume hood variance project. It was kind of a very interesting thing to get involved there. So the Ashley 110 variants, I think that was kind of fun, and I felt a very good at the end when you're able to get the variants, and that has, I think, one of the biggest environmental impacts that we have in terms of there.
Very cool, the variants. At this point, I do have a question coming in from Imka. Imka, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'd like you to ask your question because I think it's pretty relevant about the travel. Imka, would you like to ask the question again?
Sure. Larry, you must have traveled so much throughout your career and lived also at various places. Did that ever become too much at times?
At times, yes, but if you kind of enjoy the work, it's part of what you do as part of the job. Because again, you know, my biggest enjoyment the last couple of years has been visiting the campuses and working with people and giving them advice or feedback in terms of their programs and all that. So I enjoyed that. That made the job kind of fun and interesting.
Great. And I have Travis Clark calling in from UCSF. Travis, I liked your last question about the challenge. Travis, would you like to ask that question to Larry live?
Sure. I'm kind of in a public place, so I don't know if you can hear me very good.
Very good.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, Larry. I thank you for this presentation. It was wonderful. But I also was interested in your view, having been there from the beginning. What do you see as our largest EH&S professionals challenges? What's our largest challenge moving forward into the next 10 years?
Okay. Moving forward in the next 10 years, again, we talk a lot about it, was just developing a safety culture with our customers. We're starting to scratch the surface, but it's not where it could be and all that. So it's working with the folks. And again, as a lot of us in EH&S on campuses know that the pushback we get is more from the old time researchers. So I think as things proceed along and we get more newer PIs into the chain, that we'll see an improvement in terms of how they view health and safety rather than pushing back on when we're trying to really help them. That's kind of what I see there. Okay.
Very good. And I think we have time for another question from Kyla from UC Davis. Kyla asked, Larry, will you continue to be professionally active after your retirement from the UC?
Yes, I still plan to probably do some work with universities in terms of helping them develop their health and safety program. So that is on my radar for the next couple of years I'm looking at. Okay.
Very good. So we have a few minutes. I'm going to give us 1 minute. I've unmuted everybody. And so I'm going to ask, does anybody have any last words to share with Larry?
Ladies over there. There's no media there.
Just unseen and just sort of unseemly kind of crowd. And
does anybody have any more last minute things they wanted to share? Go ahead. You have a moment to ask now.
This is obviously my first course of construction. You may always be impacted between
I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody again, but Larry, I'd like to thank you so much on behalf of the University of California for sharing with us your 45-year retrospective and just for being so kind as to create these relationships that we've had throughout the years to connect with each of us and teach us that the way that you can get success and be very effective is just be a good person, just be willing and giving. And so I really learned a lot from you myself, and I'm sure that everybody joins me in saying thank you, and we appreciate you, and we hope to see you more after you leave. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and finish up this event. Although somebody did ask a baseball question, and maybe I'll leave you with that as a last question. How many A's games will you attend next season? Somebody asked.
Oh, my target would probably be 25 games next year.
25
Okay.
baseball games.
Okay.
Lots of stuff to do for you in the next year. So thank you, Larry. And so for the rest of us remaining, we appreciate you attending today's event, and you will receive a link to evaluate today's webinar, and we will give you a chance to continue to ask Larry questions. And he's tasked with his final homework and to get back to you about it. So definitely evaluate, give him some feedback, let us know if this is useful for you, and we hope to see you at the next session in the future. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your holiday season. Bye.